was a new Robin named Jason Todd, a replacement sidekick whom many people hated.
You hear about characters taking on a life of their own. Jason was the best example of that I've ever personally encountered. Nobody set out to make him an obnoxious little snot, but he kind of was that.
In 1988, Batman's crazed, white-faced foe, the Joker, captured Jason, beat him to a pulp, and set off an explosion. DC left his fate up to the readers.
If they dialed the 1-900 number, he survived the explosion. If they dialed the other, the kid didn't make it. And we waited.
DC received 10,614 calls. The verdict, death, by 72 votes. When the mainstream press got wind of this, they were outraged.
I think most people thought it was Dick Grayson. People had an emotional investment in Robin, even if they hadn't seen a comic book in 20 years. I used to have a little Batman symbol on my jacket lapel. I went into a Fifth Avenue deli to buy a tuna fish sandwich, and the guy looked at that and asked who I was, and I said, I edit Batman. He said, "Hey, this is the guy that killed Robin!"
Batman later found a third Robin, a nice kid named Tim Drake, whom fans did accept. But the death of Jason Todd continues to haunt Batman and Denny O'Neil.
I thought I was a guy writing and editing fiction. I realized that no, the Batman editor and the Superman editor are more than that. We are the custodians of folklore.
The 1980s ended with the release of Tim Burton's movie, Batman. The film seemed to signal a new era for superheroes. But just ahead, there would be big trouble.
The sad, horrible, pitiable collector's bubble, which came very close, I think, to wiping out comics for a second time.
By the late 1970s, the average comic book cost 40 cents. This was too much for some young readers, but not enough for most newsstand dealers. Comic book publishers needed a new outlet for their product. They found it in the growing number of stores that were selling old comic books as collector's items.
If we've got these comic shops selling used comics and back issues, we should be able to get them the new comics. That would be cool.
The superheroes moved off the newsstands and into several thousand stores scattered across the country. These stores became like private clubs, catering to a hardcore base of comic book fans.
The den-like atmosphere of most comic book stores is straight out of comics. It's very Batcave-like. It's a kind of self-defense mechanism. We walk into a comic book store and it's kind of dark and dingy because they don't want outsiders coming in and being like, "What's this? This is silly."
The comic book changed from being a mass market product to a specialty item, sold at higher prices and marketed to older readers.
There's still a small group of people who react to say, but comics are for children. We point out with some passion and energy that comics not only aren't only for kids, they're not mostly for kids today.
One of the most successful and critically praised mature series was Sandman from DC's new Vertigo imprint. It was written by Neil Gaiman, who'd grown up in England with reprints of American comics.
Reading comics for me, it was like getting postcards from Oz.
DC's first Sandman in 1939 fought crooks with a gas mask and a gas gun. Then with tights and a sidekick. A second Sandman in 1974 was a superhero master of dreams. Gaiman used bits of both in Morpheus, the godlike lord of the dreaming, a very different superhero.
The idea of putting somebody in a costume seemed very odd. I thought, I don't know any people who wear costumes. On the other hand, having somebody who dressed all in black, it seemed kind of obvious to me. Whatever was going through my head, month to month, it went straight into Sandman. I could do anything, from stories set in Roman times, all the way to the Iraq War and the ruins of Baghdad.
Sandman number 19, based on Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, was the first comic to win a World Fantasy Award. Not in a special comic book category, but as Best Short Story. Previous awards had gone to noted authors like Harlan Ellison and Jorge Luis Borges. some on the committee felt that a comic book didn't belong in such company.
We got the award on the Saturday night, and on the Sunday morning, they changed the rules to make sure it could never happen again. It was more than closing the stable door after the horse had gone. It was more like closing the stable door after the horse had gotten out and won the Kentucky Derby.
At least Gaiman still got respect at DC, where he had complete creative freedom. Almost.
When I wrote the Serial Killers Convention episode of Sandman, I had a reference in it to masturbation, and a message came down: people do not masturbate in the DC universe.
Over the next decade, comics, like movies and TV, would experience a sexual revolution.
In the 1990s, comic books began to take on issues, explore issues that they never would have come close to before, like homosexuality.
Gay and lesbian characters would proliferate. In The Authority, Apollo and Midnighter are violent crime fighters and tender lovers. In the early 1990s, comics were making a lot of money, and not only for publishers. Unlike their predecessors, writers and artists could now own the characters they created. And if a new superhero hit big, its creator could make a lot of money, like Todd McFarlane. McFarlane had made his name as an artist and writer on Spider-Man. In 1992, he and a few other popular artists formed Image, a creator-owned company that challenged the big two of Marvel and DC with comics like Spawn. When Al Simmons, an African-American assassin for the U.S. government, is murdered, he comes back as a hellspawn with superpowers from the devil. He battles heaven, hell, and human evil, all the while trying to get used to the idea that his wife is now his widow and married to his best friend. Spawn #1 sold 1.7 million copies and led to an animated series on HBO, a live-action movie, and a line of toys.
There was a point in the early 90s where comic book creators, writers, artists, publishers were all becoming millionaires.
Because comics were now sold in specialty shops, it was easier for publishers to put out one-shot issues that weren't necessarily part of the hero's regular storylines. These were called graphic novels, which sounded more impressive than comic books. Occasionally, the stories were openly political. By the early 1990s, some politicians saw these graphic novels as a way of embracing or promoting controversial issues. A 1993 anti-handgun story from DC had politicians rallying around Batman to help raise awareness for stricter gun laws.
Batman was a more logical character than Superman because Batman's parents were killed by a gun.
Virginia Governor Doug Wilder showed seduction of the gun to state legislators as an example of why a stringent handgun law was needed. The law passed, and the governor invited writer John Ostrander and editor Denny O'Neil to the signing ceremony. A few years later, in 1996, comic books were used to raise awareness about the dangers of unexploded landmines. DC produced a special Superman comic that could be distributed to children in Bosnia. The issue warned children to steer clear of undetonated landmines.
We were told by people over there, who we met later, that they really feel we saved some lives.
Batman also joined the campaign with a special issue Denny O'Neil wrote called Batman, Death of Innocence.
Batman is trying to save a little girl whose father has been killed by a landmine. And he gets her almost all the way, and then she sees this shiny plastic thing, and she picks it up and dies. Batman fails to save this little girl.
Some landmine activists had hoped that the Batman graphic novel could be used as ammunition in a campaign to encourage the Senate to sign a treaty banning landmines, but the proposed treaty failed to pass on the Senate floor. Superheroes may have lost occasional battles in national politics, but they were nearly killed by the economic ups and downs of their own industry. At the start of the 90s, business boomed as investors saw comic books as a haven during the recession.
An influx of speculators came in, people who really weren't reading comics, they were just buying them as investments.
There were articles in the newspapers that comic books are a better investment than the stock market.
Stores marked up comics that were only weeks old and sold them for several times